Years ago, there was a program, I really, really enjoyed it, but it was a particular program, it was like a documentary type of thing, and they took special forces. They took several different special forces groups, and you've got special operations forces, and you got special forces. Special forces are simply Green Berets. That's what special forces are. They're the only special forces. Anybody else, like Navy SEALs, 75th Ranger Division, all these different groups, regiment, they are special operations forces. So there's a difference, and it's in military terminology, and you probably don't care one way or the other, but that's just their terminology. And if there's any of them sitting here, I don't want to upset them. I want to make sure I get it right, okay? And this program was amazing because what they did was they did studies, and they took these group of, actually these were Navy SEALs, I think it was. Yeah, U.S. Navy SEALs. And so they took this group of men together, and they took them to a warehouse, and they set this warehouse up to be what they would call a shoot house, sometimes called a kill house, but mainly a shoot house. And they would go in and they set up targets. And these men don't know anything about where these targets are. They're in another room, and they have to go in and do a certain series of things, and then pick up a weapon here, rack it, and take out the enemy. And everybody, all the targets are not enemy. There's some with women holding babies, and they have to be able to choose what the targets are and leave the good people and take out the bad people. That's the purpose. And so they had this thing, and for their base study, they would bring them in. It was totally dark. They bring them in, they turn on the lights, and then they have to walk across this board and climb under this and go over this and do stuff. And then they have to get to the places where the weapons are, and they pick them up, and then these things would come on, and they would shoot them. And they timed how long it took them to do that under normal, just relaxed conditions. And their time was, I believe, I should have looked it up, but I believe their time was like literally 26 seconds to go through this house, take out do all this stuff, take out the bad guys, and get to the other door. Pretty phenomenal, right? Then, even more amazing, and this is what got me to really start looking at it, then they took these same guys, because now they had a baseline of time to compare to. Then they took these same guys and put them in this huge vat filled with ice water. And they put them in this thing, and they did thermal imaging so they could tell the body temperature. And they kept putting in more and more ice, that kind of stuff. And they kept putting in so much ice that they said, okay, and they actually, before they started talking about it, they said, okay, by this many minutes, the body will start to lock down. It'll start draining energy out of the limbs, and it'll draw it toward the core, and then the body temperature will drop because that's a safety mechanism. It's a survival mechanism because it will forfeit a limb to save the organs, essentially. And so you could see it. And he said, it's going to be this much time and this much time, and by this point of time, they'll be doing this. And they're recording this whole thing, and they're doing the thermal imaging so you can watch it. And they're going through, and they said it was something like 8 minutes in, and they should see these certain changes. And then at 15 minutes in, they should see these other changes. And at 17 or 18 minutes in, then they're going to have to pull them out because that's where they would start to go into hypothermia. Yeah, they're freezing. They're freezing to death by that time. And they're talking about all this. Then they take these Navy SEALs and they put them in this water, and it has water in it, but then they put in all this ice. And they're like, okay, and they're watching the time, and the first time goes by, nothing's changed. And they said, okay, put in more ice. So they started dumping in more ice and more ice and more ice. And they said, well, by now, his body temperature should have dropped to this, but it's not. And they're like, well, we can't explain that. We don't know why it's not dropping. And so they kept doing it. And it literally took almost 3.5 times the amount of time for them to get their body temperature down to the point where they wanted it. Then they started later, now kind of jumping back and forth, but later they asked him, why you defied physics? Your body temperature stayed the same for this long, and then it changed. Why did your body do different than what a normal person's body was? They said, because I wasn't there. And they said, what do you mean you weren't there? They said, as soon as I got in there, as soon as I started feeling the cold, I put my mind in a tropical paradise.
All right.
And he said, and that's where I put myself. And he said, and I stayed there. And if I start to feel it encroach, I would reinforce it with details. And he said, but now think, so he controlled the physiological reaction of his body with his mind that actually had something to do, and we'll see in just a moment, it even goes toward the emotions. Now that was the first part of the test. Then as soon as they got his body down to a certain level, then they pulled him out really quick before his body could, regain the normal temperature. They pulled him out, and he had to go through that shoot house, soaking wet, which added weight, obviously, to what he's doing. His body temperature had dropped to the point where he was entering hypothermia at that point. And so you could see at that point he was starting to shake. Now think about this. And they said and you could see it on the video, when he went through the door and had to go down this, he had to walk across this plank type of thing and get there and crawl under and do all that stuff. And when he picked up that weapon, which was a pistol, he picked it up and you could see it. He was like this. When he picked it up, he went straight from shaking to steady. Why? Because this was what he was familiar with, and his mind was on this of what he had done 1,000, 10,000 times before, and not where he was at that moment. Then he went through the entire shoot house and did it in almost half the time he did it the first time. Under all of those adverse conditions, he actually lowered the time because of where he put his head. Now, that same thing. Now, when I saw that, I'm like, okay, what got my attention, because I was Christian, and I looked at that and I said, okay, this guy just tapped into his spirit. He was not operating just out of his mind. Now, the military teaches you to train the mind, but they don't realize, well, maybe they do. Actually, they do now. But back in the day, they didn't talk about it much. But now they know that when you train the mind through repetition enough, it becomes spiritual. And so then it's just like watching, a great basketball player or something like that. They can't miss. I think it was Michael Jordan when he was doing the commercial, and he was doing and he had to throw the basketball. And the whole point of the commercial was even the great one misses. But it took him 26 tries to miss. He couldn't even miss when he wanted to. Why? Because it was beyond physical. It had went through the physical stage to the spiritual stage. That's why everything you do will become spiritual if you do it enough. And it's the same thing with these guys in the Special Forces, or the Naval Special Warfare, Navy SEALs. What they did was they had gone through enough training that it had went past the mind. They had tapped into their spirit, they gained the strength of the spirit, and then lent that strength to their soul to allow them to do what they're trained to do. I just gave you the secret of Samson. That's what he did. Now, the difference is, with Samson, is he also had the unlimited backing of God in his power. Whereas with humans, there is a limitation unless that human is connected to God. But the limitation of a human is so vast that most people don't know where that stops and God starts. That's just the way it is. Now, the thing is, whenever it is so vast that most people, when they have, especially if they have been training any length of time in any discipline, whenever they have reached the point where they quit, physically, they still have at least 40% of that strength or ability to continue on. Most people go halfway, a little over, 60% instead of 50, but still they go 60%. And that's the point with that, is that, and it's funny because when you go 60%, you've got usually 30, 35%. Then you've got 30, 35%. We could drop it down to 32. And then you've got the last, which will be actually 33 technically. But still, it's only 99, so there's still 1%. So, but in that middle part, the 30%, 33% lower part, 33% higher part, the 30% middle part. Do you know what that 30% middle part is called in trying to think of the right term, scientific terms or proper grammar. You know what that would be called? Mediocre. Mediocre means to go halfway up a mountain. In other words, you go so far and then you quit. Most people are only mediocre by choice because they still have 40% energy left, but they choose to quit at the 60%. Now think about all this that we're putting together, and that especially when we talk about the emotions. When you think you have been pushed to the point where you're fixing to explode, you still got 40% in reserve that you're choosing not to tap into.